The video is called Dragons or Dinosaurs? Just hope it works. Please work. And it's not coming through, is it?
You have a book separated by mankind for 65 to 70 million years. Yet, we have right
there. Now.
There. So it's good. Now these are very interesting. These are various statues and figurines from around the world that describe dragons. But if you notice, even this thing, it looks much more like what we would call a dinosaur. And so the question that this is going to raise is, where did ancient people come up with this idea? Did they see creatures that resembled this that they made figures of? Okay?
Why picking that one?
It's a good story.
You know someone's gonna say something.
Like what? Got something against Danny?
Oh, don't play dumb, you know what I mean?
And people's attention goes right to the dragons. People want to know about dragons.
Dragon legend is absolutely a phenomenon. There are literally too many legends to count. They're in every tribe and nation, every people group, and you have them in China, Australia, Africa, Europe, North America, and South America, everywhere people inhabit.
Dragons are really interesting creatures. I think there's not a child whose soul is so dead that he hasn't become fascinated by dragon stories and dragon legends. And the thing that's always struck me as amazing is that it's not a regional legend. It's not a legend of the Chinese, but nobody else, or a legend of the Europeans and nobody else. It's everybody's legend.
Now,
that is an important point here. It's like this is one of those universal myths, universal stories. Every culture has this story of dragons. The interesting thing about them is that they always look similar. They are similar. There are these reptilian type creatures that are huge and ferocious. Now you would think that if this were something that the Chinese invented, okay, they may look a certain way, but the North American Indians would come up with something else, and the Europeans would come up with something different, and the African regions would come up with something else. The fact is that when you look at ancient cultures from around the world, and they describe dragons, they're always looking similar in that when you boil down their characteristics, they are reptilian and big. It's like, well, where did anyone get that idea? And why is it universal? Okay.
legend is, of course, a legend. It's a fairy tale. But is there, in fact, most anthropologists will tell you that whenever you have a legend or mythology, that there's usually something that happened that started that myth.
So the point is there is some consistent threads in these different cultures, South Sea Islands, South Pacific, American Indians, so forth. When you find the similar kinds of legends that suggest that either a common legend exchange or those legends deriving from some kind of historical antecedent.
If we were to believe that they're mythological, that really presents a logical problem for us because there is a consistency that happens throughout all the dragon legends. Of course, dragon legends can become sensational. You know, a lot of your pagan religions attach some sort of meaning to these things. Like a lot of times in Chinese mythology, a dragon would, you know, be responsible for the tides, or it would control the water or something like that. But if you scrape away all the sensationalism, you actually have a very real creature at the bottom of it, and that is consistent throughout really the entire world. You just have a large-scale reptile that has many of them fly, some of them don't, but the ones that do fly have wings like a bat, and they're carnivorous, and they're basically going to gnaw your face off. And it is consistent no matter where you go, and that truly is remarkable.
They look like big reptiles with long tails, with scales, with sharp teeth, claws, oftentimes 3 claws, by the way. Which many of the dinosaurs did have 3 claws, like the theropods. So I believe they're what many people have called dragons, or translated to the word dragon, really reflect a human experience, widespread among almost all cultures, of having witnessed at some point in history very, very large, very frightening reptiles.
You know, the dragon legends, the stories of these dragons, they always talk about these huge reptilian beasts with fierce teeth and prickly spines, and they just sound so much like dinosaurs.
It's like knowing about Julius Caesar or Alexander the Great. We have to rely on historical records of these things, because you can't scientifically prove that Julius Caesar existed, or it's a matter of history. And I think dragons, a lot of that will be widespread historical writings of such creatures, including, for instance, the Chinese count.
By the way, this is an image of St. George and the Dragon, a very popular saint in England, if I'm not mistaken, who was, the story is that this creature was terrorizing a town, and St. George went out and killed it and freed the town from it. Now, that was part of what made him a saint. So there was a St. George, but many people think of this story as, well, it's just one of those legends, you know, it didn't really happen. They're just building him up as more than life. But you have to wonder, why would people invent this wild tale about this saint, you know, that if it never really happened? Why tell a lie about a saint? Does that make sense?
Right.
That doesn't make sense, you know? So you're going to tell a lie about this thing just to make him more popular. To me, that says something about the saint then. It's like, okay, he's a saint, but you have to tell lies about his miracles? Right? You see how that doesn't make sense? So then the next question is, well, what do we think happened? Well, he killed a rhinoceros or something? Where do you get rhinos in England? You know? And why didn't they say it's St. George and the rhino? I mean, they knew what rhinos looked like. You see what I mean? So it begins to wonder, did he kill something like a Komodo dragon that lived in England at the time? Something like that. Or a dinosaur-esque type creature. You see what I mean? That's what we're talking about here. Okay? That there's probably something more to this than we have been thinking about.
Calendar where you have 12 animals. One of them is a dragon. I was born with a year of a dragon, but all the animals are treated as equally real. So it does seem like the Chinese people did see a creature we would now call a dragon, which they call the long.
Actually, there are a lot of legends of dragons being used for breeding. The Chinese have stories about breeding dragons. There are artifacts that show people riding these things.
It's quite remarkable that, to many people, that Australian Aboriginal people actually have accounts of their ancestors having encountered creatures that today, by any reckoning, you'd describe as being dinosaurs on the basis of scientists' reconstructions from fossils. On a personal level, I recall meeting a university researcher in the Northern Territory in Darwin after giving a presentation there a couple of years ago. and she said that she'd been working with the local Larrakia Aboriginal people, and they had a word for a fierce creature that lived in the local swamps there that used to terrorise the first Aboriginal people who'd come to that area via canoes from another country far away. And when this university researcher said to them, oh, that word obviously means crocodile, the Larrakia people responded, no, we've got a different word for crocodile. This other creature, in fact, looks very similar to some of your dinosaurs in your children's book about dinosaurs.
There is an Indian legend called the Thunderbirds. And according to legend, these huge bird-like creatures would fly and they would actually be able to bring thunder with them. And at first that seems sensational. But if you start looking at the evidence, things change just a little bit. Because what is in the Black Hills in South Dakota, the legend is that these giant thunderbirds would actually fly to the top of the Black Hills and they would like nest there. Now what is fascinating is that scientists have long believed that those kind of gigantic creatures needed strong winds to propel them to high heights. And so in the West, where you have these gigantic thunderstorms, it is really postulated these gigantic pteranodons would catch thermal updrafts of these storms that would lift them to the top of places like the Black Hills. So from an Indian's perspective, that is trying to pull meaning from the things in nature, they would look at these, what they would call thunderbirds, and go, wow, they are bringing thunder. But it's actually, what's really happening is that it's the thunderstorms that are actually bringing the pteranodons.
This is taken from a book named After the Flood, where he recounts, dinosaurs in the form of flying reptiles were a feature of Welsh life until surprisingly recent times. As late as the beginning of the present century, elderly folk at Penlyn in Glamorgan used to tell of a colony of winged serpents that lived in the woods around Penlyn Castle. As Mary Trevelyan tells us, the woods around Penlyn Castle, Glamorgan, had the reputation of being frequented by winged serpents, and these were the terror of old and young alike. An aged inhabitant of Penlyn, who died a few years ago, said that in his boyhood, the winged serpents were described as very beautiful. He said it was no old story invented to frighten children, but a real fact. His father and uncle had killed some of them, for they were as bad as foxes for poultry. The old man attributed the extinction of the winged serpents to the fact that they were terrors in the farmyards and coverts.
That, I think, is the reason why, if these things really did exist in the past, how come we don't see them in zoos today? I think it's just that reason. These were terrifying creatures to live with, and as a result, they were hunted to extinction by man, like St. George. If there was a creature that we would call a dinosaur today that was terrorizing a village, the best way to get rid of it was to destroy it, because it was just a terror, and it was so frightening. And so I think that can explain why we don't see them today. It's similar to the reason why we don't see woolly mammoths anymore, even though we know archaeologically that American Indians coexisted with woolly mammoths here in the United States, because they used to kill them and use their hides for tents and teepees and so forth, and use the ivory of their tusks for weapons and hooks and things. So we know that these kinds of things coexisted with humans at one point. So it's not that much more surprising to think that some of the dinosaurs that survived after the flood were later then hunted and killed because of their terrible dispositions.
The pteranodon, an example of one, and by the way, not all of them were huge with big long wings. And in Beowulf, it describes two different kinds. One which had massive, huge wings, which we know existed from fossils, 30-foot and more wingspan. But there's another kind of winged serpent that was smaller, but it was just as much a pest, not just in Beowulf, but in England and to the North American Indians and Central American Indians, etc.
Interestingly, there's a Scandinavian king called Beowulf, and there's a very famous poem about his exploits. And if you read about his description of this big beast that he killed because it was terrorizing the villages, it's a very accurate description of a Tyrannosaurus rex.
Most people say Beowulf is entirely mythical because there's all these monsters in it. But if you read Beowulf, the poem, it doesn't say fairies and magic elves. It's talking about the Grendel. It's talking about a bipedal monster with giant mouth and big teeth that ate people, just like we might imagine a theropod dinosaur might do.
In the Agat National Park in Nebraska, there are these structures in the side of the rocks called Devil's Corkscrews. And for years, scientists thought that the plants or some sort of plant created these spiral structures that descend from the surface down about 6 feet. But it was not until they started excavating them that they found these little fossils of beavers at the bottom of them, and they found out that these beavers made these wild corkscrew lodges in the rock. And evolutionary timelines would put this beaver to be extinct about 30 million years ago. But the problem with that is that American Indians know full well what those corkscrews were. If you would have asked a Lakota Indian, they would have told you they were beaver lodges.
My point with Haas Eagle is, the Maoris tell a legend about a giant eagle. And it's easy for us to say, oh, giant eagle, pff, whatever. But it's been verified and it's published. It's the real deal. It was a giant eagle. So if they were right about the giant eagle, then perhaps peoples have been telling the truth in their legends of other creatures too.
Most people today accept that dinosaurs have become extinct, and even creationists who look at the accounts of apparent recent human dinosaurial contact would say, look, it does seem that dinosaurs are extinct. However, there are some tantalizing accounts of sightings in very recent decades from various places around the world. In the Congo, for example, the local people there talk of a creature they call Mokele Mbembe. And when Westerners have gone in with drawings of African creatures and dinosaur handbooks, and they've pointed to pictures of, say, the hippopotamus or the rhino, the people have said, no, that's not Mokele Mbembe. And when shown a picture of a sauropod dinosaur, in a dinosaur handbook, they've pointed to something like a small sauropod dinosaur. Another example comes to mind, the Lake Murray region of Papua New Guinea. There were people there out in a canoe, and as they looked under their canoe, they saw a large creature swim under the canoe